for us to reflect and remember those people who lost their lives on September 11th, 18 years ago. It is a very personal thing for me. I did not lose anybody, but at the time I was working in Washington, D.C. My office was on 16th Street, a few blocks away from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I remember getting out of my car, walking to my office, getting up to my office, and talking with my assistant, who actually was on the telephone with someone working in the Pentagon, when the line went dead. We were then told that we had to leave because there were all sorts of threats of bombs all over Washington, and particularly bombs at the White House. But at the time I was working for the Community Foundation, and it wasn't as simple as just kind of going home and watching the videos. I had to immediately begin to think, what did we need to do for the people who were impacted in Washington, D.C.? Because we knew that the attention would be in New York, and that was not a bad thing. But we needed to do something for the people in Washington, D.C. And we established a fund called the Survivors Fund. And the purpose of the fund was not to just dole out money, because what we knew was that it wasn't just money that was going to help people, but we had to help them the way they felt they needed help. And we did that for 7 years through a fund that we thought we'd get about $5 million in it, and ended up getting $28 million. And they came in increments as large as $5 million and as small as a gift from a child of $1.36. This was going on right at the same time that the, what was the white powder? The anthrax thing was going on in DC, and they were telling everybody, you know, don't open envelopes from people you don't know with writing you're not familiar with. And I'm thinking, this is all I'm doing, is opening bins of mail. But it was for me an event that made me a better person, to know that it was through what we could do, and I was just a funder, but I was able to help people create memorial benches. I was able to help first responders train themselves for a different job because they could no longer do that work. I was able to help children who never even knew their parent actually save for a college education. So this day is very, very personal to me. I also was sideswiped by an ambulance that day on 16th Street in DC, and I thought, oh boy, this was not what I wanted to do today. But I just wanted to take a moment to remember those souls, not just the souls lost, but the souls incredibly impacted by that day. So if you would, please, let's take a moment of silence. Thank you. Now, for our speaker this evening, Robyn Henderson-Espinoza, PhD, has been described in a myriad of ways: a scholar activist, scholar leader, thought leader, teacher, public theologian, ethicist, poet of moral reason. I love that one, but this is my favorite. And word artist. I love that. Among these ways of describing Dr. Robyn, they are also a visionary thinker who has spent 2 decades working in the borderlands of church, academy, and movements, seeking to not only disrupt but dismantle supremacy culture by focusing their PhD studies on new concepts of being and becoming, decolonizing knowledge production, and bridging with radical difference. They enflesh a deep hope of collaborating in these borderland spaces, where their work seeks to contribute to the ongoing work of collective liberation. Dr. Robyn is the founder of the Activist Theology Project, a Nashville-based collaborative project that seeks to work with the dominant culture and produces curriculum at the intersection of scholarship and activism. and we'll forgive you for the Nashville address. Activist theology as a disciplinary offshoot of liberation theology and movement idea has been incubating since 2008 with Dr. Robyn, and further developed throughout their doctoral program and engagement with movement leaders. Dr. Robyn was named one of 10 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress in 2018. As a scholar activist, Dr. Robyn is committed to translating theory to action so that our work in the borderlands reflects the deep spiritual work of transforming self to transforming the world. Dr. Robyn writes and creates both academic and other valuable resources, including digital resources. Dr. Robyn is a non-binary trans queer Latinx who calls Nashville, Tennessee home. They are the author of Activist Theology in 2019, so it's coming out, folks, published by Fortress Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robyn to the stage.
Thanks so much for coming out, y'all. I'd like to start all of my talks.
Sorry about that.
Can you hear me? I'm short. Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I like to start all of my talks with the recognition of the place and the folks from whom I come. I'm born of a Mexican woman who is not from this country and an Anglo father, which means I'm a mixed race Latinx and I have white passing privilege. Those are very important things to name. I think maybe my mom is watching on the live stream. I hope so. So to the museum, thank you for this generous invitation to join the speaker series at the National Civil Rights Museum. We went on a tour and it was remarkable. I'm left with a lot to consider. Of course, as an academic, I tend to spend a lot of time in my mind and my head, and now I'm noticing being in the space, I feel things in my body, which is really a wonderful experience. And being at the museum has not only left me with a lot to consider, but has made me wonder about our current moment, which I don't need to remind any of you that we are in moments of tyranny. And thank you to those who came out for this conversation and this evening's talk. I hope that we can have a robust conversation during the Q&A after I deliver my thoughts, and I look forward to your thoughts and how we can think together, rethinking intersectionality. You may have questions after my talk, and I encourage you to ask your questions. Intersectionality is a concept that is, I think, underexplored in our movement work and is easily collapsible into cliche marketing. And that frustrates me, I should say. So know that I'm ready to hear your questions and to think together. One of my favorite things to do is to think together with folks. So I want to make a claim, which will inevitably sound political, and it is political, and it needs to be political. The claim is this: intersectionality has been co-opted and watered down in many places, canceled in favor of the liberal notion of identity, which not only fuels white supremacy, but endangers those of us who have social experiences that are undermined by the logic of white supremacy. Intersectionality has been co-opted. What do I mean by the liberal notion of identity? What I mean is that a turn away from neoliberalism means a turn toward nationalism and identity politics that establish norms. One way of understanding this is that the United States is a Christian nation, and therefore the identity of such policies must be aligned with a national understanding of Christianity. These norms that get created establish particular values when it comes to identity. We can see that if the majority of those who are living in poverty or below an equitable wage threshold, there are norms and values attached to their identity. One of the best questions I got from the local newspaper is a question about class and poverty. And we are not having the adequate conversations around poverty because there are established norms and values attached to poor people and capitalism. which is part of supremacy culture. I believe this kind of orientation to identity fuels the logic of white supremacy and other supremacy cultures like that of capitalism and nationalism. And we need to rethink identity through the lens of intersectionality so that our experiences with one another are richer and we can actually work to undermine the very system that keeps all of us from connecting with our most radical differences. So intersectionality. That is probably a term that many of you have heard and tossed around in movement work or in your faith communities or on the 24-hour news cycle. When intersectionality was developed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, it spoke to the interlocking oppressions of Black women in particular, exposing the sometimes triple or quadruple experiences of oppression and their interlocking realities of these oppressions. In fact, it was a lawsuit that Crenshaw was reviewing. And Crenshaw discovered that this lawsuit exposed that the woman mentioned in the suit, a Black woman, was being triply oppressed because of her race, her sex, and her gender. That is the premise of intersectionality. The interrelatedness of oppressions that impacts marginalized people in severe ways. This is what she called the matrices of oppression. Patricia Hill Collins, a sociologist who coined the term Black feminism, was also pivotal in framing intersectionality through the lens of matrices of oppression or matrix of domination. Central to both scholars' work is the lived experience of Black women. This is not a social construction of the liberal-based identity politics that serves to reinforce norms. This is real life for women of color, and we need to rethink intersectionality on these terms. And I mentioned both Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw because it's important to name where concepts come from. And Black women in particular get erased and canceled in academia. So I named those two names as a political term to say these voices are important, these concepts are important, and if we don't rethink them along the lines in which they were established, we are canceling them and we are commodifying them and we are co-opting them just for popular sake, which is wrong. In my tradition of theology, we call that sinful. Well, that's not the talk that we're having tonight.
No, that's fine.
So I would like to propose a strategy of rethinking intersectionality that I find dynamic and appropriate for today's political moment. I believe that when we begin to imagine our futures and when we begin to think about the 7 generations that are to follow us, we get a little bit closer to the vision of liberation. So the strategy of rethinking intersectionality is not a replacement for intersectionality. It is a tactic to deepen our intersectional awareness and practice. One of the things I love about living back in the South is the nighttime sky. I'm originally from Texas and growing up in Texas, I love the big vast sky that showed me all of the wonder and grandeur of the cosmos. It helped me imagine possibility. I think when we think about the radical interconnectedness of all things, we get a little closer to rethinking intersectionality. I propose to do that through the language of constellations of difference. Might this be a way to imagine a future together that isn't encumbered with toxic politics, but a real honest endeavor to build the kind of communities we want to build through recognizing and living out our deepest differences? Could it be possible? I would like to think the language of constellation might help us move in that direction while holding the deep and tragic consequences of what it means to be impacted by the matrix of domination. There is a pernicious and particular logic to domination that I write about in the book that drops on October 1st. The museum does have one copy, so maybe you can ask them to look at it. Apparently I was supposed to bring 3 copies, but I only brought 1, so I had to mail the other 2 copies. This matrix of domination, which bears the logic of dominance. The logics of dominance are products of a brand of moral reasoning that attempted to justify oppressive values, norms, behaviors, and scripts. Such logics is circuitous in its frame and pernicious on its aim, since its only goal is to return to and sanction its own evil beginnings. Of course, you can read that in the Act of Misogyny book that comes out later in this fall. This is important because we have to figure out how to rethink intersectionality in ways that keep central the matrices of domination as the very thing that we need to both dismantle and transform. So constellations. How might constellations help transform this particular methodology that exposes the matrices of domination? Is anybody into the sciences? I like science. Anybody into science? I had to look up the definition of constellation. I was like, am I using this term right? This is what dictionary.com says. Everybody uses Google these days, right?
Yep.
A constellation is a group or cluster of related things. We know that race, class, sex, sexuality, ability, gender, and other things are all connected to our lived experience. What we also know is that over time, our lived experience changes. That is a common theme for all of us. Change is the affirmation of difference when thinking philosophically. So in order to rethink intersectionality, I want to propose that we think through our lived experience in the language of constellations of difference. In order to unhinge from the neoliberal category of identity that represents generality and also stabilizes being and functionally produces supremacy cultures, we need some sort of concept of movement or change to account for the ways that the evolution of our lived reality accounts for the real and imagined differences in our lives. I think the concept of movement here that fits is the concept of difference. It is important to note that blackness or brownness is not a stable reality, neither is whiteness. Or in philosophical terms, it is beyond ontological categories. There is exponential potential in blackness and brownness and whiteness. And this exponential potential helps unmask constellations of difference in the manner in which blackness and brownness and whiteness changes based on lived experience. This change is the difference that binds together the constellation in order to help us rethink intersectionality. A year and a half ago, I launched my scholarship as a collaborative project or think tank for liberation. I like that better, think tank for liberation. We call our little incubator the Activist Theology Project, and some of the team is here tonight, for which I'm grateful. One of the important things about the work of activist theology is its commitment to incubate sustainable change by responding to the needs of the world. We think this is best done by and through storytelling because stories are a particular production of knowledge or epistemological importance that help us connect the beingness of difference and the production of knowledge that then shapes our social practices or ethics. In academic terms, this is called ontology, epistemology, and ethics. And these three domains are important as we rethink intersectionality through the lens of the politics of radical difference. Our work is to bridge difference in radical ways, and we do this through story, companionship, connection, media, and advocacy. We are committed to living the politics of radical difference in such a way that helps us harness a moral imagination for another possible world, a world comprised of radical differences that has collective liberation as its normative horizon. Difference is commonly understood as something that is in opposition to something else. This is different than that. But I think this is an emaciated way to use the term difference, because difference actually is a robust concept that can help us rethink our politics, our ethics, and our ways of being in the world. I consider this the positivity of difference over against the commonly understood negativity of difference. When I consider the constellation of difference as a way to rethink intersectionality, I'm considering the ways in which movement and change are part of the ways we understand the multiple intersections that create and recreate our lived experiences. Our lived experiences are not static nor stable, and therefore our intersections in how we think about ourselves also cannot be static or stable. One intersection cannot represent all intersections. And the place where difference helps us reimagine intersectionality is through overturning the stable conceptions of identity and allowing difference to take place and create the kind of movement and change necessary for intersectionality to be the dynamic tool of understanding lived experience of those who are most impacted by multi-system oppressions. I often think about this in terms of when we think about our lived experiences and when we think about change and difference, that we find unity in our deepest differences. And we actually don't have a world that honors that. We have a world, as illustrated here in this museum, that privileges separation, that privileges segregation, and that actually privileges a logic of separate but equal, which doesn't mean anything, right? It means that people of color are always on the bottom, to use that hierarchical language. When we think about intersectionality, we often don't think about the story of what makes up those intersections. But when we consider the stories of our lived experiences, that of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, sex, and others, we see more of an overlapping story of these lived experiences that highlights the difference in the deeply interconnected realities of these lived experiences. This is what I consider to be the constellations of difference that help us reimagine intersectionality. The work of rethinking intersectionality or reimagining intersectionality is the deep work of learning to tell the truest stories of our lived experiences. Intersectionality is not a stable or static thing in and of itself. It's an ever-evolving constellation of difference. This constellation of difference is a deeply entangled reality of lived experience, and we must not fall prey to bad identity politics when thinking about the importance of the interlocking realities of the interconnected stories of our lives. Learning to acknowledge the interlocking realities of this entangled web of existence is what will help us not only rethink intersectionality, but live more honestly a life of radical difference, where the values of our lived experiences are seen as valuable and important rather than a deficit that needs to be altered. When we make the move to actually consider that our lived experience is a constellation of difference, we move closer to the impending change that moves us closer to the vision of humanity whose goal, I think, should be collective liberation. Avoiding the real differences that already bind us together is choosing not to be fully present in this amazing experience called life. We are a Venn diagram, existing along a plane of becoming. We must remove the bigotry and hate that so many of us have embraced and internalized, and imagine a future where the radical interconnectedness of all things, also animals, the earth, etc., will help move us closer to a vision of collective liberation. This is the politics of radical difference, an entangled web of interconnected realities that bring us into the fuller vision of one another. Thinking about intersectionality through the lens of both constellations and difference, I think helps us move in the direction of a larger, more freer existence, where the bonds that tie us together are not the bonds of inequity, nor the matrices of domination, but bonds of revolutionary love. It is because of the reality that all things are connected that we are able to weave a web of connection together to imagine a new vision of connection and equity. When we rethink intersectionality along the lines of constellations of difference, we displace the prevailing norm of oppositional politics, this is not that, and invite the politics of radical difference to help us achieve equitable relationships and model a beingness that is deeply engaged with all that exists. When we achieve this kind of beingness, we affirm the positivity of difference and can imagine a life where the politics of radical difference helps us frame the kind of intersectionality we are hoping to embody. This work is the work of moral imagination, the work of our current organizing efforts, and the work of building the kind of world we want to inhabit. It's time to get our hands dirty with difference and with constellations that make up our beautiful and messy world. This is exactly what the Activist Theology Project is doing, reimagining our world through the lens of difference and incubating sustainable change. This is what is possible when we rethink the things that connect us over against the things that separate us. When we actually commit to a politics of connection or in conjunto over trying to rationalize what separates us. We engage difference in new ways and participate in the stories of lived experiences in new and generative ways. This is the act of painting the canvas of our lives with constellations of difference. This is telling the truest stories of our lived realities, and this is rethinking intersectionality. And this word makes for another possible world where we are all free. Thank you. So I think we have time for Q&A. Is that right?
Yes.
And I don't know what time they shut the party down.
Don't worry about it.
But my bedtime is 9 o'clock.
There's that question.
So, what exactly is intersectionality? And are you defining it based off the inclusion of your opinions and perspectives, or are you defining it based off something else?
So it's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a critical legal scholar, and it's was further expounded upon Patricia Hill Collins' work, Black Feminist Thought. And intersectionality is a methodology that looks at the interlocking realities of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and so forth, that often exposes the ways in which marginalized people are more oppressed than the dominant culture. So it's a way of thinking about identity, but through a language of interconnection or the interlocking realities of lived experience. So that's just a definition of intersectionality. What I am suggesting is it's been co-opted, and we're not actually looking at the ways in which the logic of dominance severely impacts those who are marginalized or those who are most impacted by oppression, and that we're using intersectionality like we're all intersectional, and we're actually not looking at the ways in which the lived experience of those who are marginalized and most impacted by oppression are actually the recipients of this oppression. So I'm trying to push us a little bit to rethink intersectionality while hanging on to the matrix of domination and the matrices of oppression. Does that help?
It does.
Thanks.
So does your definition, which I think harks back to the original definition, have application in situations where we're not talking about cumulative oppression, but where an identity is in some cases oppressor identity and in other contexts oppressed identity?
Well, let me see if I can get at your question this way. I think the liberal notion of identity politics, it reinforces things like white supremacy and oppressor identities. And what we need to do is we need to undo the supremacy culture that creates that sort of settler colonialism identity. We need to undo that, but we also have to undo what oppressed people receive, right? So it's like undoing on both ends. I think intersectionality applies to, well, in the truest form, to Black women, right? But we also know that whiteness is not static or a monolith. And when we talk about working poor white folk, they also have an intersectional identity, right? Maybe it's a working poor disabled white person, right? That's also an intersectional identity. So I don't want to lift intersectionality and say that it doesn't apply to other identities, because the reality is that we are all deeply interconnected, right? I think we have to work to get to the place where we can put these in conversation with one another, because historically, intersectionality has applied to marginalized people. When we rethink intersectionality through a lens of radical difference, it's a chance for us to hold both at the same time and rethink it, so that we can undo the supremacy cultures that impact both. Does that answer your question?
It wasn't exactly what I was asking, but it was a very insightful answer.
Okay. Yes. I think there's a mic.
I'm old enough to remember the birdcage model of oppression, with the different lines of the birdcage being different forms of what happens.
Yeah.
And that how intersectionality with the web that acknowledges the interactions between them, although it kind of assumes that each intersection is the same, and I don't think it is.
Right.
But and I like the idea of the constellation of differences because it gives us a path to work towards as opposed to just describing. Right? But could you explain a little further about what about the interrelationship of lines of oppression, and how does that fit into the constellation of differences?
Well, this idea of the constellation of difference and its relationship with intersectionality is, I think, some of the work that we're trying to do at the Activist Theology Project, which is transform supremacy culture. And we think we do that through bridging with radical difference. And those are two sets of curriculum that we're unveiling here in the next little bit. So I want to say that to think about the interlocking realities of oppression, and to also think about constellations of difference, we have to at some point make a claim that either we're connected or we are not. And if we are connected, how are we connected? I believe we are connected through the politics of radical difference. And that we both share a breath. And so nothing separates us, right? And so if that is true, what is creating the division? Well, it's the reality of interlocking oppressions, systems, systemic violence, institutional violence, right? So we have to figure out how to transform supremacy cultures, capitalism, patriarchy, war culture, empire, so that we can unhinge and untangle the interlocking oppression, so that actually we can get to living this constellation of difference.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi.
I'm Carl.
Hi, I'm Robyn.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you, Carol.
So, I like that you like to be called a word artist.
Yes.
Because I love words
Yes.
as well. I wanted to know, who are your top 3 word artists?
Well, the one who wrote for my book, Rebel,
Okay.
who is a Ferguson, St. Louis organizer on the streets during the Mike Brown protests. She does amazing poetry. The other person I would have to say is Gloria Zadua, who just writes magic. And I think the other person that I would say, I'm a theologian, and so I look to some of the stuff that I've read. I think Jesus had some really great things to say that we have recorded.
Hi. I have a question about how you see your theory of constellations of differences transforming faith spaces. We've talked very generally about culture and society, but people of faith have their own special way of supremacist culture, and they hide it in religious language, so it can be harder to call out and even harder to change. But you strike me as the kind of person who spent some time thinking about this.
Yeah, as in 3 degrees worth.
So I'd love to hear you talk about how this can transform faith.
Yeah, I think our faith spaces, whether they are churches or mosques or synagogues, all have some sort of root system of supremacy culture.
Oh, amen.
And that shows up in the theologies and the liturgies and the way we treat people or not when they come in the door, how they welcome trans people or not. And because I spend time in both faith spaces, movement spaces, and the academy, this is something that's very close to me. And I think I'm in the pulpit more than I would like to be, and I try every time when I'm in the pulpit to actually preach a theology of difference. And I think if we are not preaching that God is a black trans woman, then we are actually part of the problem.
Yeah.
And if we are not preaching that God embodies a non-binary divinity, then we are part of the problem. And so our theologies have to match our practices, right? So this is where I would say theology and ethics are related. We have to preach and act in alignment with one another. And if what we're doing in society, this is like always my test for people. They want to be a social justice warrior. They want to like go register people to vote, but they're going to continue to buy their coffee at Starbucks. Are you not thinking about capitalism while you're registering people to vote? Because the people who you're registering to vote, we also have to figure out how not to serve the almighty U.S. dollar, right? So these things are related. You have a church, but you're serving Starbucks in your narthex of the church. Why aren't we talking about the ways in which gentrification impacts communities when the Starbucks goes in, right? So we have to, what we do in society has to be done in church. And if we're unwilling to have that conversation, then it's part of the problem. And it's a theology of supremacy culture. I mean, I just, plain and simple.
It's true.
Anyone else?
Hello. I think maybe I'm misquoting you, so correct me,
Sure.
please.
I don't know if I remember what I said, but I'll it's been a few minutes.
You said blackness, whiteness, brownness. The term you said beyond ontological categories.
Yeah.
Is this meaning that these terms are fictional and that they create real realities, or that they are true, but they can't be defined within our language because they're so vast?
I mean closer to the latter. This idea of beyond ontological blackness comes from my colleague Victor Anderson up at Vanderbilt. He wrote a whole book called Beyond Ontological Blackness, I think. And it's this idea. What I want us to sit with is, and I use the phrase exponential potential. I really like the idea of potentiality, and when we imagine what is possible. We have created such a cultural narrative around blackness and brownness and whiteness on some level. And I want to disrupt that cultural narrative because it's violent and it's harm producing.
It is.
And I want to say there is such, blackness, brownness, and whiteness, when we get away from supremacy culture, when we get away from racist ideology, we can actually imagine blackness as being beautiful, as being this thing that is yet to become. And the same for my own cultural background, being Mexican. But we also have to do that around whiteness, because we've so stabilized a narrative around whiteness as being the dominant culture, in power, etc. And that is a toxic way to think about whiteness. So I want to, so the second part of what you said is closer to what I'm getting at.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
So there was an exhibit done several years back. I can't remember how long ago, but it was called "Race: Are We So Different?"
Yes.
And the anthropologists.
It was in Chicago.
It was all over.
Okay. It was
been
in
here. It was
okay.
here in Memphis
Yeah.
at some point as well. But the anthropologist talked about race as a social construct
Yep,
that does not truly exist.
that's right.
So can you talk a little bit more about that as you talk about blackness, whiteness, and brownness?
Yeah.
I'm done. Okay.
The president can't even get the microphone. So race is a social construct. That's not to say that race doesn't matter, because race does matter. But race was, we can go back to the invention of race during the Enlightenment it was used to categorize people. And it was used as a system of hierarchy to put white people on top and colored people, is what they called them, on the bottom. And that meant Native American, that meant anything other than white. Well, you look at our context here in the United States, and it was further delineated during the U.S. Census creation so that we know how to mark people as citizens, which is a logic of coloniality and empire making. And so, when anthropologists and sociologists and other people talk about race as a social construct, they're absolutely right. What they fall short of saying is that the social construct is so embedded in our cultural memory that we actually don't know how to talk about race. And so some of the work that the Activist Theology Project is doing is actually getting to some of those supremacy roots that prevent this conversation of even having a conversation about race. Because if we, and just like I answered this question earlier about separation, we actually can't come together and just breathe, because we're embedded in this cultural narrative that is predicated on the social construction of race that separates us fundamentally. So we don't even have a chance. It's by design. The system is working as it should. And I'm trying to dismantle it all with the help of my friends. Does that answer your question?
I'm not quite sure how to word this. If something happened to you today, and you'd say, I had an impact, I made a difference, what tangible thing or what group or what has happened because of your work that you can see a change in what you are, what you believe? And I guess adjacent to that is, what would you expect or what would hope that we would leave here with something that we could do that would promote and your understanding of what you're doing?
I don't think much about any legacy that I might or might not leave. I hope that what I leave is the question, what kind of people do we want to be? What kind of world do we want to build? If I leave here tonight and I die, I hope that is something that bubbles up for people as they're drinking wine and pan dulce at my funeral. That's not a metaphor for the book event that we're having. We're having pan dulce and wine at my book event in a couple weeks, which is not to be confused with my funeral. So I think that I think one of the things that I hope that you leave with is, I hope you're inspired to think and ask questions. Because I think one of the things that our current political moment is doing is silencing those who have questions. And if we're not asking questions, then we're just participating in the separation of one another and not breathing together. And not moving toward a change. And so I hope that you'll ask questions. And I hope that you'll feel inspired to bridge with someone who's different than you. Because if we're not doing that, then we're staying in our silos and we're staying in our homogeneous groups, and we're not cross-pollinating our thoughts, and we're not loving. Thank you. Yeah. brother got a notebook up there.
So to me, first of all, I really appreciate you shouting out the sociologists.
Yeah.
I love sociology, so
Are you a sociologist?
Trying to be maybe.
Great, great.
But so to me, the sound, like your work sounds very, and please correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, as a more cultural change. Like you talk about the culture of white supremacy,
Yep.
the culture of everything. So is your work more focused on culture or political in nature? Like where is the intersection? We're not bad word, but where do those cross paths
Yeah.
in terms of where is your work focusing more on the culture of things or political? How do they intermingle together? Just expound a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to not create too many categories. I mean, I think that my work cuts across culture, politics, religion, ethics, philosophy. I use a lot of philosophical concepts in my work, but I translate them. When I'm not giving a lecture, I tend to do storytelling, and I do storytelling as a political move for liberation. But like some people call me a political theologian, some people call me a philosophical theologian. I do contextual work, and so like the book that I've written is Constructive Theology or Contextual Theology, but it has a lot of politics in it. It has a lot of philosophy, continental philosophy. I'm trained as a Deleuzian, which is a French post-war philosopher. So, I'm an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary thinker. And I try very hard not to land on one category too much, lest I be sucked into it, So I try to be, I want to have a lot of glitter in my work, to use that metaphor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you already over there. Hello again.
I'm ready for round two.
All right, I guess.
I won't say Jesus this time. I'm a theologian, I feel like I'm obligated.
I was just learning about intersectionality in my class. College at UNM, shout out to UNM. Anyway, my question is I learned that the name of something can cover up what something really is.
Yes.
So the combination of constellations, of differences, I wanted to know how did you choose to combine those two?
Yeah, so difference is a philosophical category that I work with. And I also read the Chicana queer Tecana Gloria Anzalua, who works with interrelatedness, interconnectedness. And I thought that the interrelatedness of differences, rethinking intersectionality, was too cumbersome. And a little bit like I was trying to be, what is the term when you're using all the same letters? I thought, they're going to think I'm trying to do alliteration here. And so I thought about what is another term for interrelatedness or interconnection? And I thought constellation. And that made me think about how I grew up in Texas with the vast sky, and then it helped me imagine possibilities. And I think what intersectionality helps us do and what difference helps us do is imagine another possible world where Black women in particular are not oppressed by the bullshit. And so that's how I came up with that. That help?
Yes.
Great. Are you here for your class? Did you have to report?
No, I'm
I didn't know.
It seems that we are living in troubling times.
It does sound like that.
Country.
I call it the tyranny of the now.
And I do also sense that there are constellations, and I think that we are breathing together. However, just next door to that constellation are those that are fearful. can you just talk about the fear or expound on, you know, our friends who, you know, could be in the constellation or maybe are, but still fear is just so much in the forefront.
Yeah, you know, the fear is by design. And the fear is working just as it is designed to work. And I think what we have to do, for those of us who are breathing together and who are committed to getting our hands dirty with one another, is transforming the fear into revolutionary love. And that means sitting down with people. I mean, we've got an epidemic of gun violence in this country. We have got to sit down with people. A lot of us don't know how to listen. We might be breathing together, but we don't know how to listen. And until we begin to tell the truest stories of who we are and really commit to the radical act of listening, only then can we transform ourselves and one another into the kind of humans that we want to be. This is a real call for a new humanity and a type of collective vision for liberation. And you know, I was talking with a newspaper earlier, and the reporter asked me, do I have any hope? And this is a really, really challenging question because I've staked my life on this. I'm trained as a theologian. I have 3 degrees in theology. I believe that we can make a better world. But I have no hope in our current system. But I have hope that we can be connected together in deep ways and uproot the system. I do have hope in that. But it's a collective vision. And we are all not on the same page. And that's not to say that I don't believe in a diversity of tactics. I do. I believe in a diversity of tactics. But we don't actually know how to lock together to actually do the work of revolutionary love.
Thank you.
Okay. 3 for the win. This is the last question.
So, I myself have been figuring out what I'm passionate about, and I feel like you have a pretty strong passion for what you're talking about.
Thank you.
I wanted to know, when did you realize you had a passion for this?
When I was 16 years old, I had a brain aneurysm. And it was a week before my 17th birthday. And my pupils were fixed and dilated. I was clinically dead for a period of time. And had 2 brain surgeries. And, you know, with the exception of the scar, you wouldn't know there's anything wrong with me. My friends might tell you something different. My friends might think there's a lot wrong with me. But looking at me, you wouldn't know anything wrong. And I missed 1 week of my senior year in high school. And I was in the marching band. And I went back to school and I started playing again. And I got fed up and frustrated because I couldn't remember all the moves of the routine that we were doing, and the band director said, "You're not walking off this field. You're going to march this year." Because I was just like, I'm just not going to do this anymore. And he wouldn't let me. And he said, "You have too much to give. This is your last year." And that made an impression on me. And so fast forward when I was in college and I gave up my music scholarship to study philosophy and theology, there was a burning fire in me that I'm like, ideas can change the world. Ideas can change the world if we know how to live them out.
Wow.
And so I would say in college I found the passion. Yeah, thank you.